Sometimes we forget why we're here. It's easy to fall off track. These help us remember.
These battle scars don't look like they're faded, don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battles.
Growing up, I had a dream, something no one else could see. Tell me what it means when your faith is falling beneath your knees and you can't breathe. Everything you see reminds you of what you're not or something you won't be. You gotta take what you're given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe in a business. Not because they wanna do it, just because they heard it pays. And who the fuck wants to be poor knowing that's how we've been raised? Society is getting heavy, I can feel the weight. The pressure of success is like 100 million pounds of shame. And that's the reason I'm staying up late, trying to find a way to escape the stereotypes. This day and age is making me feel like the only way I'll be happy is getting signed to a label and making money through rapping. I wanna share my emotion because this world is attacking the very principle of life that lets the people be happy. If you don't have a reason to breathe, why even live? These battle scars are impressions of everything that it is.
Don't look like they're faded, don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battle scars don't look like they're faded, don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battles.
If I had a voice that reached 100 million people, I'd tell them there's a reason that we're all created equal. Cause some decide to be great and some decide a sequel to an average person's life is simply what they want to be. So you make your decision, all I know is what I'm given. Won't define the life I lead or the way I dwell in existence. I've seen a greater image on the walls of where I'm living, and the words twisted and scripted remind me of something written. Faith is a gift that is given down to the people. If one believes it, one receives it. It's given if it is needed. Don't ever think you're trapped in a life that you never wanted. Your options are infinite, that's some mathematical logic. I'm not saying I'm a prophet, I'm speaking for what it's worth. These lyrics define my prayers and these battle scars on my church. Not saying I'm a prophet, I'm speaking for what it's worth. These lyrics define my prayers, these battle scars on my church.
Scars don't look like they're faded, don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battle scars don't look like they're faded, don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change.
Well, ooh, had the mic in my face. Hello, everyone. How are you doing? I hope you're having a wonderful night. I'm very glad tonight has come so I can put an end to at least the prep work for this show. There's going to be, well, it's not going to be terribly an extended introduction, but I do need to do my typical introductions. And I've got my Libertarian Party of Louisiana drink glass here. And good evening, JJ. And I've got some much needed mimosas. That's definitely what I need to settle nerves. I know people think I have nerves of steel, but I actually don't. I actually detest confrontation, and I know a lot of people don't believe that. But like, I was just getting extremely nervous leading up to tonight because I know there might be some dissent, and I just really don't like that. And I kind of got cozy with my little history shows where there was no arguments, and now I'm doing like party disputes again, and I have to tell you, I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm very solid in my opinion on what's going on. But before we get started, let me do the YouTube stuff. And there already is way more people watching than is typical, but that's good. And let me ask you, please share this out because there's a lot of people with questions. And my goal is hopefully to answer some of these questions from my point of view. And this is going to be from my point of view. I will make every attempt, as I always do, to fairly represent opposing views. But I am not pretending to be unbiased. I am definitely biased. I definitely have a point of view. We'll talk about that more in a moment. So please share this out to your social medias. Okay, so first off, in my real YouTuber stuff, since there's a bunch more people watching that normally do, please subscribe to my channel if you enjoy this type of content, even if you don't normally watch the historical stuff that I do, but you like my coverage of what's going on in the party and getting into the nitty-gritty and making it understandable to the average person. Please do me a favor and subscribe to my channel. Unfortunately, as we come up on convention season, I think we're probably going to have a few shows like this. I hope we don't. But we probably will. So please subscribe. Next up, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter. I don't even know why I have MeWe there. I post there like once a month when I remember it. But I'm Karen Ann Harlos everywhere. I would appreciate a follow on Twitter. My Twitter following's getting up there for me. I think I'm at close to 10,500. And lastly, and most importantly, in some ways, if you truly, truly like the content that I produce and the amount of time that I put into it, please consider becoming a patron and supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/Pink Flame of Liberty. I can tell you the only reason I was able to do the show is because I was off this week. There is no way I could do this topic justice this quickly if I wasn't off this week. And, you know, having patrons allows me to take more time off, as it were. It's a second job for me. It literally is. So speaking of time, I do have some notes. You know, I'm not a big notes person. When I want to script something out, I don't do it live. To me, having something scripted out live defeats the whole purpose of being live. But, okay, this is my brief notes. Okay? I've got more. I've got a whole pile here. And then I've got some handwritten stuff on the back while I was sitting here during the theme song. So let me do some of these preliminaries that I will revisit with more detail, but I wanted to get these statements right up front. And I am going to be keeping an eye on chat. And I will circle back to things I think need addressing, but I might not address them right away because I want to keep with the flow that's in my head before I lose it. Because I am getting older. I am of a certain vintage. I could get very easily distracted. So, some of the things I scribbled down while the theme song was playing. As I said, this is going to be semi-organized. I like doing free flow live streams, which means, despite my best intentions to keep this manageable in length, remember that on Massachusetts, my first stream on it was 3 hours long. I'm going to try not to do that here, because people, you know, a lot of you, you know, you don't do Robert's Rules of Order for your daily devotionals. Some of you might, but most of you don't. So I'm going to try to not make this a 3-hour stream. And if it starts to look like it's going to be that, but no promises, I'll break it up into some shows. And this probably will not be the only show I do on this, because there's things happening every single day. So it's semi-organized, but I will go off on some rabbit trails. All right. I asked for this to be shared everywhere, so there's going to be some opposing points of view in chat. I always welcome opposing points of view as long as you're polite. If you get abusive, you're gone. But as long as you're polite, opposing points of view are fine. I might not address every point, particularly if I think it's getting repetitive, but you're free to chat freely, and there's plenty of able people in chat to also answer questions. Because I want to make it clear, it's something that I had said to a friend before, but I think it's something that needs to be said publicly, is I have no obligation to debate anybody on this. I am giving you my opinion. I'm using a platform that I've spent 3 years building up in order to have the trust and reach to be able to do this. I am not retained by anybody in this matter. It's not anything before the LNC, so there's no obligation for, I think I got lipstick on my teeth. No, I don't. You know how paranoid I am. There's no obligation for LNC transparency here. This is my free time that I get to choose how to spend it. And I'm glad to cover things, but I get to direct that because this is my time and I'm a libertarian and nobody owns me or my time. And again, I'm not getting paid. Okay. So, let's go up to speaking of time. I want you guys to rest assured that I have reviewed every single public piece of information on this. If I had to guess on how much time I've spent on this, I'm up about 25 hours now. That's why I said that I put a lot of time into this and I come at my opinion from a reasoned place, whether people agree with me or not. I started working on this on Sunday. I took Monday, I worked on it when I wasn't supposed to, as Andrew Chatterton knows, because I PM'd him some questions when it was supposed to be my day off. Actually, I've been working on this, I think, since Saturday, pretty much nonstop. And part of what I've been doing was getting all the documents up on LPedia. I will show you guys the LPedia page because we're going to go through some of the documents on LPedia, and I'd like to show, who is called, I wore my watch. There we go. Isn't that great now? So my phone calls, because you know I do record with my phone. So no one can accuse me of not putting the time in, and I hope that shows as I go to discuss this. I'm probably not as familiar with it as the people who have lived this, but for an outsider, I am thoroughly familiar with this. Okay. There's some themes that I'm going to bring up. And I will bring up specific examples. There are people who can disagree in good faith. I don't think they're right, but they can disagree in good faith. And I will, in good faith, show how I disagree. However, and I will give specific examples of this. There are some people, not the professionals, not the Judicial Committee, but there are some members. I don't know whether they have a board position or not. I'm not deeply entrenched in the LPMI. There are some people who are definitely acting in bad faith. And I will give specific examples of that. And when there's bad faith, we'll get into, I have some things to say about that, but there is definitely some bad faith going on here. And I will give examples of that. I'm not going to just lob that out there without giving specific examples. But what's really the bad thing in all of this is bad bylaws. Bad bylaws. When will we learn as a party that, as I said in one of my history shows the other day, if I needed an operation, I could have a bunch of friends surrounding me, good people, good activists. I'm not going to have someone operate on me who's the first person to raise their hand. I'm going to ask if they're a doctor, if they know what they're doing, if they have any kind of training in this. If you're going to buy a house, you're going to have a real estate professional assist you with that. In almost anything that is a specialty, you're going to have people that do this for either a living or a very dedicated hobby. And I also don't think that requires being credentialed, though credentialing is a shortcut, just like voluntary licensure in a libertarian world, to let you know people have a certain background. But I don't believe in the cult of credentialed parliamentarians. My friend Mike Seebeck is a very able parliamentarian, and he doesn't have a credential. But he's got the experience to show it. Now, sometimes you don't have somebody in your body that has this background. Then when you have your volunteer bylaws committee, you run it by somebody who does, even if that means spending a little bit of money. I'm just asking the LPMI members, whether or not you like what happened, you didn't like what happened, don't you think it would have been worth it to spend a few $100 and avoid all of this? Please, for the love of God, do not have people who don't know what they're doing be the only people that touch your bylaws. If you can, put people on your committee that know what they're doing. And if you want to train up some people, mix in a minority of green people with people who know what they're doing to start to teach them, because we do need to build our bench. And if you're not confident in their ability, then have a professional review it afterwards. I'm going to give some specific examples of bad bylaws here that have nothing to do with what happened, because the badness of the bylaws are not limited to this situation. And I want to give you some phrases that, if you ever see in bylaws, should be a big warning sign that at least at some point in the creation of your bylaws, there was someone who wrote them that didn't know what they were doing. Let me give you one example right off the bat, and we finally got this out of the Colorado bylaws. If you see the term simple majority, that is meaningless. Every word in your bylaws should convey some meaning. Adding the word simple to majority adds nothing but ambiguity. All the weight is carried by the word majority, which has a clear definition. You add the word simple before it. That's what people who think that sounds very parliamentary and very smart, but isn't. It's not smart. No, smart's not the right word, because very smart people can just be ignorant of Roberts. That doesn't mean you're dumb. It just means there's something you don't know. There's a lot of things I don't know. But if you see the phrase simple majority in your bylaws, take a real close look at your bylaws, because somewhere along the way, there was someone who really didn't know what they were doing who amended them. The word majority carries all of the weight. Now, I don't think the words simple majority are in these bylaws, but something just as bad is in it that I will show you. There's a principle in Roberts that every word in the bylaws is presumed to be there for a reason. And if the same thing can be conveyed without that word, it's presumed that that word is meant to modify what it would mean. And there's, not that I necessarily agree with this, but I found this a very intriguing article that was in the National Parliamentarian, that an argument can be made that a simple majority is a plurality. Because why else would you add the word simple before it when all that weight can be carried by majority? And going back to my case, where I was railroaded by the LNC, the only reason I had a right to a trial, and I know some people disagree, I ended up winning that, all hinged on the way terms of office are described. Do you realize that whether or not your officers get due process all hinges upon whether your terms of office use the word or and, or their equivalents? Whether it says they serve for X number of years, or until their successors are elected, or and until their successors are elected? You wouldn't think so much weight would be carried by a conjunction, but it is. And parliamentarians know that. Yes, there is a way to protect the bylaws committee recommendations from spurious amendment and convention. That might go beyond what we're talking about here, but if I have time, I will address that. Second point I wanted to make here, actually it's probably like my 10th point, whatever number point it is. There have been professional parliamentarians who have weighed in on this. I mean, absolutely no shade to them, even though I'm going to disagree in some points. I like what the Judicial Committee said, that this isn't a democratic process, that if you line up enough parliamentarians on one side, that that's the right answer. No, it isn't. Look at the arguments. And there could be non-parliamentarians that have very good arguments. I actually think the Judicial Committee opinion was very well argued, and as far as I know, there's not a parliamentarian among them, but there is a lawyer, and those are related disciplines in how to argue. And there's also a respected LNC member on there whose work and logic and argumentation I deeply respect. So absolutely no shade to the parliamentarians. I am going to disagree sharply with them, but it's not meant as any kind of impugning of their abilities. I just think they're wrong. And that happens. Also, unlike many other of these party disputes, I hit my microphone, that have come up, I wasn't involved in this one previously. I have really close to zero emotional investment. I had heard in the beginning that Andrew might need a parliamentarian, and I referred him to JJ, and I pretty much stayed out of it. I've been busy with other things. Most notably, New Mexico. I learned all the facts and arguments as to what was going on after an appeal had already been filed. So I'm coming at this very virginal and sweet. And as always, I've got friends on both sides of this dispute. One of the people on the other side is Joe Brungart. He and I were on the platform committee for last convention, and I believe we have a mutual respect for each other. I think he's dreadfully wrong here. But this isn't I like one side and don't like the other. It has nothing to do with that. I'm sure there are people on both sides I like and people on both sides I don't like. When rendering a parliamentary analysis, that has nothing to do with anything. Oh, something else I meant to mention when I said bad bylaws. I'm going to say something here that might sting. But sometimes you got to hear the tough love. Something else that went on here, and again, I am going to give one specific example of it. When you're in leadership, you're a public figure, and you're open for criticism. In some respects, you had a poorly educated board. Not only do your bylaws committee need to be qualified, when you're serving on a board, it's incumbent upon you to learn the basics at least. And if you don't know them, to rely on some people who do. But I have to say, there were some comments made, one in particular in the Judicial Committee hearing, that I'm in the Libertarian Party. It doesn't take much to take me aback or shock me. Or surprise me is a better word, and there is something I'm going to bring up. So boards need to take it upon themselves. If you are going to be in an elected position, you have a duty to educate yourself. And within the confines of your bylaws for your dispute resolution procedures, ultimately, and yeah, I'm going to talk about that, Freedom Wizard. I absolutely think Joe was out of his tree with that comment. But ultimately, within the dispute resolutions and rights you have in Roberts and your bylaws, a society ultimately gets to interpret its rules. And in the case of Michigan, that is through the Judicial Committee. You can disagree with the Judicial Committee, but that is now the authoritative interpretation. To continue arguing about it until I think, I'm going to be blunt, is stupid. Your efforts should now be directed towards fixing your bylaws so that this doesn't happen again. All of these petitions for special conventions, when you have an annual regular convention coming up this year, well, it's going to be this year in a few days, is a waste of time and resources. It is just a big dick measuring contest, and it's stupid. Grow up. You win some, you lose some. You regroup to fight another day. But y'all, your priority should be fixing your bylaws. And if you don't like the Judicial Committee decision and who was put in at leadership, you are fortunate. Within, at the latest, 7 months, because I think you have to have your convention between March and July, if I'm correct, you're going to be able to vote in a whole new leadership if you want to. I can tell you from personal experience, losing my Judicial Committee appeal on the LNC in December, and then the National Convention was in May, it goes fast. Wasting all of this time and parties' resources. I'm just going to tell you my personal opinion. You have every right to do it under the bylaws, to try to call a special convention, get everyone's dander up, get everyone lathered up and upset. But to me, that's more about ego and not about really caring about electing leadership, because you're going to be doing that anyway. If your convention was a year off, year and a half off, I could get it. I'd be right there with you. That's what you should do. But not when it's coming up between March and July. And we're going to even talk more about this, about something in the bylaws that makes this even more dumb. Organize to elect the board you want at your annual convention that is coming up. Okay. So let's go back to some of these points here, because I said some bold things that I think need to be proven. And just to prove I've done some research, not only do I have this stack of crap, I've got, well, one of these is Robert's, but I also consulted some secondary works. And there's something, I know Robert said this somewhere, but I can't find it. And it's not mentioned in Robert's Rules of Order directly. I am a big believer in equity and good faith. And I think that's just common sense. I mean, I'm going to put something up here that might not seem directly relevant, but it's just like our Constitution is our bylaws. Forget about the religious part. Bylaws and rules are wholly inadequate for the governance of any society that is not acting in good faith, which is what I take morality to be. And other parliamentary authorities are not binding, but they are persuasive, particularly when your parliamentary authority is silent. And I've got here the American Institute of Parliamentarian Standard Code of Parliamentary Procedure. And on page 10, it says fairness and good faith. All meetings must be characterized by fairness and good faith. Trickery, overemphasis on minor technicalities, dilatory tactics, indulgence in personalities, and railroading. And I deeply feel that, because I was railroaded, and I do believe Andrew Chatterton was railroaded. It threatens the spirit and practice of fairness and good faith. And it goes on to note, fraud, unfairness, or absence of good faith can cause a court to hold any action invalid. Motives ought to outweigh objections of form. So anyway, the effectiveness and, in fact, the existence of an organization are destroyed if its officers or members condone unfairness or lack of good faith. And it's like I said in my issue with the LNC. I know they argued, and I firmly believe that some of them and some parliamentarians believe in absolute good faith that I was not owed due process. I disagree. But here's my question to you. Why in the world would people of good faith not want to give due process, whether or not they were required to give it? As moral libertarians, we should want to bend over backwards to give due process. And part of due process is notice. I've often said, and this is not a parliamentary argument, this is a libertarian argument. And it also goes back to my experience with biblical exegesis, that you have to read the Bible in the culture and context in which it was written in order to understand. I believe the same of Libertarian Party bylaws, that you have to read them not in the culture of the sterile letter of the law in Roberts, though I think the letter of the law is on our side. You have to read them in the culture of ultimate respect for the rights of the individual, that is the libertarian culture. And not bending over backwards to give notice is a violation of libertarian principles, in my opinion. This is not a parliamentary argument. It is a good faith libertarian argument, and that did not happen here. And you would not want to be treated that way. Simple as that. No, he wasn't, Andrew Chatterton wasn't entitled, quote unquote, to a trial. He wasn't entitled to an investigatory committee. He wasn't entitled to a lot of things that Roberts talks about in removal of an officer. But why wouldn't you want to do that? Why wouldn't you? James, let me pull that up now. For those of you who are totally in the dark, I've spent a lot of time. Let's go to, I want to show you the page where you can find it in LPedia, and you can read all of the documents for yourself. And I am going to give an overview, but I do want you, but you know, I get very circuitous, and I want you to be able to read this at your leisure. So let me pull this up. Okay, let's take off the widget for 1 second. Let me pull up LPedia. If you go to LPedia, it's entitled Libertarian Party of Michigan Leadership Controversy 2022. Whenever it's controversial material, we put this tag on it. There's some notes there. If you're ever going to edit this, please note that it tries to, you need to put things that can be objectively proven, or if it's something that's an opinion, clearly mark it as opinion. So there is a summary narrative here. And maybe I'll read this because I think that will help. And then there's a timeline. And the timeline has documents to support almost everything. And there's some references and endnotes. So yeah, let me read the summary narrative because I think I will say this. I think this written summary is probably better than me just rambling. It says on June 14th and 15th, so right after the National Convention, Chair Tim Yao and First Chair Ben Boren, along with Brandon Warziebach, I think is how you pronounce it, resigned from the governing board of the Libertarian Party of Michigan. At that time, Andrew Chatterton was second vice chair and automatically ascended to the chairmanship. I know some people dispute that. That's in the footnote. We'll get into that. I don't think that's disputable, but some people do dispute that, so I did note it. On July 9th, the LPMI held a candidate nominating convention during which Mr. Chatterton ruled filling the board vacancies out of order due to a failure to give proper notice of filling these vacancies, which was overturned, and the vacancies were filled. At the same nominating convention, there was a vote of no confidence against Mr. Chatterton, which removed him as second vice chair. The motion was never noticed to the membership. I I probably need to correct that. It was untimely notice to the membership. So I think that sentence is slightly inaccurate. I'll fix that. But was noticed to the Executive Committee on June 19th, 2022, which you'll note is what? I don't know how many days are in June. I think there's 30, so 11, that's 20 days. The vacancies were filled as follows. Joe Brungart as chair. He was elected as first vice chair and then auto-ascended to chair. Mike Salaba as first vice chair. Mary Bazuma as second vice chair. Raphael Wolf as District 6 representative. Joe Algus as District 6 representative. Greg Stempfel as District 9 representative. And Kyle McCauley as District 10 representative. And Scotty Bowen as District 14 representative. Mr. Chatterton appealed his removal and the election of persons to fill the vacancies to the LPMI Judicial Committee. His appeal was granted and he was restored to his position, and the elections to fill the vacancies were voided. The major issue on appeal dealt with the character of the nominating convention and thus the type of business that can be conducted therein and notice requirements. The appeal was granted on the grounds that the nominating convention was not, per the bylaws, a regular meeting in which any item of business could be taken up, including filling vacancies and the motion of no confidence, without notice other than nominations of candidates for public office. Multiple parliamentary opinions were submitted, and they were all in agreement that the filling of the vacancies was improper. I will note that one of them was kind of wishy-washy on that, but came down on the side that the filling of the vacancies was improper. And Andrew, tell me anything that needs to be corrected, because again, I wasn't there. Regardless of whether the nomination convention was a regular meeting or a species of special meeting. The parliamentary opinions were divided on the issue of the propriety of the vote of no confidence, which all hinged upon the nature of the nominating convention. A number of the member submissions in support of the original actions noted that filling vacancies and other actions were done at nominating conventions since they were added to the bylaws in 2017. But there is clear direction per the parliamentary authority that notice is required to fill vacancies, and there was no division in the parliamentary opinions on that issue. While it was argued it was the intent of the makers that the additions of the nominating convention and national delegate selection convention was to add regular conventions, and intent is persuasive in reconciling ambiguities, and with the divided opinions, it seems clear that there was at least some ambiguity, though the extent of it may be arguable. The Judicial Committee decided that such an interpretation was not in concert with the rest of the bylaws and would render other bylaws absurd and violate absentee rights. It was alleged by multiple members that it was the prior custom to do other business, but custom and prior interpretation falls, and the event of a successful ruling that said custom or past interpretation violates the parliamentary authority or the bylaws. A further question was raised after the fact about a potential improper application of the rules on delegate qualifications, but this was not part of the appeal, and it appears it needed to be raised at the time of accepting the credentials report, though this has not been the subject of any official opinion or investigation. Like many disputes, it's always possible for people of good faith to disagree, and the process in the LPMI to resolve these issues is through the Judicial Committee, and it is the prerogative of every parliamentary society to have its own processes for resolving and deciding interpretations of its own bylaws. The full arguments of all sides were part of the record, are linked in the timeline below. I am going to address one comment by Richard Brown because, with all due respect, I think it's an utter red herring. Whether or not the July 9th convention was a special meeting or special convention is irrelevant. It was not a regular convention. I don't care if you call it a peanut butter sandwich. It wasn't a regular convention. And there was not unanimity in that. And I firmly come on the solid opinion it was not a regular convention. I think it is really a rabbit trail and a distraction to argue whether or not it was a special convention or some new species of meeting that was not a regular convention. And as far as Richard's saying a meeting is either regular or special, there's no in between. There's no in between in Roberts. But societies have the right to create other kinds of meetings. Bylaws reign supreme. Roberts also doesn't have a vote of no confidence. So if we're going to go down that route, then there was a motion that was authorized by the bylaws that is not something recognized by the parliamentary authority. Again, I would find it actually extremely offensive to libertarian sensibilities that say the bylaws cannot create something that a regular convention for a special purpose has a name. It's not a regular convention. It's a special one. Okay, so let's go back to some of my strong statements that I intend to give some substantiation for. So one of those, and I'm not going to put the widget back up yet because we have a few things to go through. One of them has to do with bad faith. I think bad faith can not just be actions, it can be intimidations and things of the sort. I'm going to play a clip that I find extremely disturbing, and I do not particularly care for removal of members, but I actually think this is a removable offense. I was once threatened in Colorado in a Zoom meeting. The person's not a party member, and we don't have removal in Colorado. To be a member in Colorado, all you have to be is a registered libertarian. You can't take away someone's voter registration. But in societies where you have to pay dues, I do think you can expel a member. It should be very, very rare. But threats definitely fall within that category. So I want to play you a clip, and the fact that this hasn't been roundly condemned by all sides, I just don't believe is in good faith. And I think this sets the tone for a lot of the attitude that is motivating certain members. Not all members, but certain members. So let's play this.
Also, I think a lot of you are new here. That's really a big surprise, and maybe you don't know me too well. Well, I'm sure you will really get to know me well. I live here in Milford, which is Oakland County, and I am half German and half Sicilian. And the wonderful thing about being a Sicilian is that when someone fucks you over, you don't forget it. So just keep that in mind when I get to see y'all in person. And I just hope I get a chance to see you. And I would really love right now just to sink my teeth into a lot of yours necks and watch.
Could you please keep your comments to be...
And then just taste the blood and
all right, the member is out of order.
I look forward to seeing
you.
You can't take it, Andrew, can you? I'm done. Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Okay, that is disturbing. You don't go in public comment and say you can't wait to see people because you'd love to sink your teeth into their neck and drink their blood. I thought Jackie Perry with the stealing hair was bad, but that was kind of amusing. This is threatening. This is intimidating. It's not as bad as the threats that were made against me, which were quite literally to beat me within an inch of my life and then put in writing, but still, that is bad. And the fact that this has not been roundly condemned by people on the other side of the issue that might not be the biggest fan of Andrew Chatterton is is disturbing. Okay, so I want to give another example of bad faith. I need to look at my glasses here to get the right thing up here. I might not have put it on the screen. I wonder if I downloaded it. Give me 1 second, because I don't think I downloaded this screenshot. I can read it if it's not up on my drive, but I'm pretty sure I downloaded it on my drive. Okay, yeah, let me download that. Let me put it up on my screen here. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this is Dave Canny, who is a board member. And let me find my printed out copy of this. Great. I didn't bring my printed out. I thought for sure I did. You know, the best laid plans. But as you can tell, I've got a shit ton of papers here. I think it's just sticking together. Nope, it's not. So I'll have to read it here. You can read it actually basically yourself. In it, Mr. Canny admits that he's bringing something as serious as a removal motion, not because he actually thinks that there was a literal breach of fiduciary duty, which is the bylaws give 2 grounds for removing an officer. It is because they failed to attend 3 consecutive meetings or they breached their fiduciary duty. He's basically admitting that he's using something as serious. And personally, I can tell you, as somebody who's been subject to a removal motion, psychologically and psychically damaging to a person. As a removal motion, because he doesn't agree with the Roberts Rules of Order and their own bylaws, by the way, provision that the second vice chair automatically ascends to chair. He wanted to force a vote for chair, and he's getting his way of doing that through a vote of no confidence. That is abusive. That is abusive, and that is not in good faith, and you ought to be ashamed of yourself, Mr. Canny. And I will note, because I actually did look this up as well, though I have to give the disclaimer that I'm not a Michigan attorney. But they did have a Michigan attorney advise them that says, because they do have they're incorporated as a nonprofit, that there was nothing in their corporate bylaws that would supersede their state bylaws. So I'm taking their attorney's word at that. However, in the Michigan Code, the first thing that an officer owes the corporation is good faith. Using a removal motion for something a removal motion isn't intended for is bad faith. And it is using people as a means to an end. And that's gross. I've been in that position, and I can tell you, I to this day, though it's not, I think mine was a little bit more dramatic because it played out on a national stage rather than a state stage. And at least now it's down to every few weeks. But I still have nightmares over this. You do not do this to a person. It's unlibertarian. You just don't do this. If you wanted to force a vote on chair, you have to find a way to do it within your bylaws without fraudulently using a motion. Now, by the time the July 9th convention came along, they trumped up some reasons. But he admitted right at the beginning it was to force a vote on chair. And when somebody tells me their motive, very bluntly like this, I'm going to believe them. So to me, that's definite bad faith. Ms., I'm going to bite your neck. that is creating a hostile, threatening atmosphere, which is far more serious than any of the trumped-up allegations they alleged against Mr. Chatterton. But not a peep about that. That is bad faith. And for a moment, because I want to get done with videos here, well, actually, because I don't want to make it look like I'm picking on Mr. Canny, who I don't even know. But another example of bad faith, let me find this, is someone using a pseudonym, which is fine, in Discord, who claimed that this is what happened with the Judicial Committee decision. Says, for anyone confused about what happened with the JC, they decided that this part of the bylaws doesn't mean exactly what it means. That is a completely inaccurate, false, dishonest characterization. Nowhere, not even in the parliamentary opinions that said that the filling of vacancies was invalid, didn't say it was invalid because it wasn't at a regular convention, because the bylaws clearly say it can happen at any state convention. But what the bylaws don't say is that it can happen without notice. So the JC actually decided that that part of the bylaws meant exactly what it meant. It can be done at any state convention, but it's silent about notice, in which case Roberts then talks about it because it says that the bylaws have to explicitly say notice isn't required, which doesn't happen. This is bad faith. Okay, so I gave some examples of that, which I promised I would do. I said I would also give an example of a poorly educated board. Unfortunately, I am going to have to pick on Mr. Canny again here. I wish it was a different board member. I'm sure this example exists in other board members. But again, when you're a public figure, you open yourself up. So this was at the Judicial Committee meeting. We're going to get into the arguments over regular and special, which is going to be the bulk of this show, but I'm setting the background here. But there's an argument that was made that sums up to this. Because a banquet was held at a nominating convention, that's an item of business which isn't noticed, which then makes it a regular meeting. I find it extremely problematic when you have someone who's on the governing board of a state party, of the third largest political party in the country, who thinks a banquet is an item of business. Do you do a credentials report to make sure you have a quorum at a banquet? Okay, so let's play this clip.
Mr. Canny.
Thank you. And I have a question for me, Mr. Jacobs, regarding the comments on the meeting. And again, I'll be brief. You mentioned that this was really kind of well, you mentioned it wasn't a special convention. It was a regular convention with a single issue nominating candidates. In your comments, maybe I misheard.
Misheard.
Okay. But am I correct in saying that this was a single issue convention nominating candidates?
I have described it as a non-regular convention that can only hear items that are specified in the bylaws. The name that I've been toying with would be a specific convention. It is a convention that is only capable of conducting these matters.
Does that include guest speakers and banquets and Defender of Liberty awards?
No.
Taking place at the convention? Because those things all take place at these conventions on a regular basis.
Those are not business. That is not business. No, it would not do so.
So that would make it a regular convention.
No, it would not do so. It would not affect those things. You could do those things apart from any meeting.
But they took place at this meeting.
It doesn't make any difference. They are not items of business within the meeting.
Defender, now I
No,
I see what you're saying. I see your point. I don't agree, but I see your point.
And I know JJ thinks fiduciary duties in the eye of the beholders. I don't agree. I didn't agree in the case of New Mexico as well. Okay, let me pull. Actually, I'm not. Guys, if you're watching live, get on YouTube where you can see the comments, because I'm going to need the entire screen to go over bylaws here. I want to get my notes. Oh, I wanted to give another example of bad faith, actually. Let's go. I'm going to read this if I can find it. Yes, an email that went out to the party membership today. So the folks calling for a special convention, they have every right to do that. But you don't have a right to break the rules to do it. Now, let me tell you, because there is a bylaws right to get a petition of members and call a special convention, I do think that if a reasonable notice is given to the board, one that's not inflammatory, that doesn't break any rules of decorum, you would need to, I think you would have to say registered. I really don't know, Richard. I just think it's ambiguous. And there's a lot of shit in their bylaws that's ambiguous, but there's some things that aren't. And one of them is what a regular meeting is. That's one thing they managed to define. But one thing, I do believe that a member can write a request for a petition that doesn't break any rules of decorum, that's written professionally, that can be, I know this isn't an odd number year, JJ. I was just pointing out a bad bylaw that had nothing to do with this year. Well, in a weird way, it does have something to do with this way, because what Mr. Canny was trying to do was amend the bylaws without amending the bylaws, and doing it by only a required majority vote. Even though he did get the 2/3, but he was trying to do it by a majority. Well, it depends on how you define 2/3. He didn't get it by 2/3 of those present, if we're interpreting it, which is reasonable the way Richard is. He didn't get a 2/3. But anyway, so you can submit to the board an email that can I ask that the tone in comments tone down a little bit? To say that somebody knows full well something they're saying isn't correct is getting way too close to saying somebody's lying for my taste for this particular discussion. We can have passionate opinions without that. Please just honor me on that, even if that wasn't the intent. It's making me uncomfortable. Okay. So you keep going off on these rabbit trails. You could submit to the board, hey, I would like you to send out this email to the membership for my petition for a special convention, and I think a good faith board would have to send it. Not if your email called a bunch of people a bunch of liars and broke all kinds of rules. However, that's not what happened. Some people had, apparently, at least this is the allegation, downloaded data from the CRM and mass emailed the members using party data without the board's consent and using it to smear other members. That's a gross violation of the non-disclosure agreement that we all signed to use the CRM, if that is in fact what happened. This brings us on a little bit of a rabbit trail with people who are so concerned that the LNC might be getting rid of Civi CRM. You want to know what the biggest danger to Civi CRM is people that do shit like this, that download data and exploit it for their own personal ends. So let's read this email that went out to the members of the Libertarian Party of Michigan. Upon sending the communication regarding party goals for the upcoming months last week, we had hoped all of us could enjoy the holiday with our families uninterrupted by further party business. As many of you no doubt noticed, that was not the case. The email correspondence concerning petitions and motions for special conventions recently sent to some members was not authorized by the Libertarian Party in Michigan. The messages were sent via an address drawn from our secure database, contrary to the terms of active non-disclosure agreements. Not only is this a breach of contract, but also a breach of members' trust in the party to secure their information. The responsible party's access to our data management system was revoked. Additional training and processes are under consideration to ensure that such a breach is never repeated. None of this is to say that our members may not call a special convention. Far from it. We have a right to call special conventions per our bylaws, and that is not in dispute. With that said, please be aware of the following information which the offending parties may not have shared with you. Our bylaws and parliamentary procedure provide alternate means to fill current vacancies on the LEC, which is, I think, Libertarian Executive Committee. I've never seen it as LEC, so I just say EC, without expending the time and resources to hold a convention which must occur in person. Our bylaws do not use the terms meeting and convention interchangeably, which, by the way, R01R does, but their bylaws don't. Anyway, moving on. Thus, online conventions are not permissible. This reflects a change which was implemented by our membership during our 2021 convention. Goes on to talk about the goals of the party, which is to elect candidates, blah, blah, blah. Gives their opinion on a special convention. So anyway, we don't need to read the rest of it, which was, the board just stating its position. But violating an NDA is very, very serious and endangers the CRM for everybody. This now goes beyond Michigan when you pull shit like that. And it makes you legally liable. Whether or not, anyone's going to actually do anything about that, I don't know. But that is extremely bad faith. Okay, let's go now to the heart of the matter in the bylaws. Just making sure I put aside the things I already went through to keep my little stack of paper here manageable. One thing I need to move. Okay. We're going to pull up the bylaws now. I'm sorry it's not as large as I'd like it to be.
That's what she said.
Yeah. Okay, that was coming. Alrighty. To me, the very, very determinative bylaws are right in the beginning. And that is Section 3. I bolded and highlighted some things. It names who the officers are, and then it says, all of these officers shall be elected to a 2-year term at a regular convention of the party by the attending delegates. As to the congressional district representatives, those delegates from the respective districts, and shall take office immediately upon the close of such convention and shall serve until the final adjournment of the next regular convention. To me, and I know people will disagree, the argument ends right there. Because there's 2 terms in there that you render the bylaws absurd if you take a position that they have regular conventions more often than every 2 years. Because their officers are elected to a 2-year term, and they serve, and they're elected at a regular convention, and they serve until the final adjournment of the next regular convention, which means that the next regular convention is 2 years from that date. With all due respect to anybody else, That is what that means. It is not ambiguous. It defines the regular conventions are the ones at which officers are elected and they occur 2 years apart. This starts and stops the argument to me. We will go to other sections, but any other interpretation renders this section absurd. And if the delegate nominating convention and candidate nominating convention were regular conventions, even though they occurred only 4 months after what is unarguably a regular convention in Section 3, all of the officers' terms would be over. And they have never, ever done that. And that would conflict with the fact that it's a 2-year term. Because, as has been pointed out, these other conventions, which we'll get into what they are scheduled. They're not a surprise. So either they were so stupid that they walked into a wall face first when they defined the terms in office. Sorry, Richard. That's an absurd argument. That's an absurd argument. Committees can function as boards no matter what they're called. I am taking 2 terms here that don't only deal with the term regular convention. It defines how often they have them. And it's not every 4 months or 4 months after an election. It is every 2 years. This bylaw clearly states that officers are elected at a regular convention, and those conventions are 2 years apart. I am sorry. I know other people can have a different opinion. I think your average person would interpret this exactly as I do. And I would have to say, with all due respect, it takes an awful lot of parliamentary education to make this mean something else. So, next, number 2, at each regular convention, every single one of them, following the selection of the officers. So every convention, if all of them are regular conventions, except for that one that is done upon special call of the executive committee or petition of the members, they have violated their bylaws since 2017, since they haven't re-elected a new board. And they didn't do so in July either. Okay. We're going to come back to my next highlighted thing. No, actually, I have something to say. Okay, I wrote out, and I'm actually going to read it. Bylaws Article 3. This bylaw is the chestnut that will be rendered absurd by any interpretation which makes the National Delegate Selection Convention and the Nominating Convention regular conventions. You factor into my story here, Mr. Brown. I want to say that I make this, with all due respect, Mr. Brown can call this wording unfortunate, but is unambiguous. It is worse, however, than simply seeing that these other conventions terminate the terms of office of the officers. It would terminate the terms of existing officers that are in place in every attempt to fill a vacancy that occurs prior to the expiration of any 2-year term. And the whole placement of the 2-year term in the language of the bylaw would make the internal interpretation of itself in conflict, never mind also in conflict with other bylaws, by having to choose. Is it typically a 2-year term, or is it a regular convention to regular convention, which are scheduled to happen much sooner than every 2 years? That is ludicrous. It is obvious that this is stating that every 2 years and every 2 years only, there is a regular convention. If they, quote unquote, unfortunately, used a precise parliamentary term but did not mean it, that only underscores that qualified people should either be writing or reviewing bylaws amendments. RONR, or Robert's Rules of Order. I say RONR because I got that from Mike. I don't know whether that's correct or not. just like I say nap when I know they don't like nap. 5668(1). When the meaning is clear, and the meaning is clear here, the society, even by a unanimous vote, cannot change that meaning except by amending its bylaws. An ambiguity must exist before there's any occasion for interpretation. If a bylaw is ambiguous, so if we want to even argue that it's ambiguous, it must be interpreted in harmony with the other bylaws. The interpretations should, so you had a must and then you had a should, be in accordance with the intention of the society at the time the bylaws was adopted, which is an argument that the other side was making, but that's a should. It must be interpreted in harmony with the other bylaws. When a provision of the bylaws is susceptible to two meanings, so we went on to paragraph 2, one of which conflicts with or renders absurd another bylaw provision, and the other does not, the latter must be taken as the true meaning. My interpretation allows the bylaws to be read in harmony, with no ridiculous requirement that they elect a board in March and re-elect them in July. That is absurd for a 2-year term. That is spelled out. My interpretation harmonizes the bylaws. And then I will agree with JJ, 5668, subparagraph 4. If the bylaws authorize certain things specifically, other things of the same class are thereby prohibited. These bylaws authorize regular conventions every 2 years. There's a presumption that nothing has been placed in the bylaws without some reason for it. It says 2 years for a reason. Bylaws Article 3 limits regular conventions by authorizing them every 2 years. And it limits the named conventions to doing only those things named unless there is an exception in the bylaws. And there is a couple exceptions in the bylaws. Ronar 5668, subparagraph 6. A prohibition or limitation prohibits everything greater than what's prohibited or that which goes beyond the limitations but permits what's less. Bylaws Article 3 limits by its very nature regular conventions to every 2 years. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of special and regular. Now, there are two possible interpretations which harmonize the bylaws, in my opinion. One of them is JJ's opinion, which I slightly disagree with, but I think it's a distinction without a difference. But I'll like to bring it up because I do think it's something that needs to be fixed in their bylaws. In this case, the issue is it a regular convention? The issue is not, is it a special convention? I absolutely disagree that you can only follow the terminology that's in Roberts. However, in my case, I agree with an interpretation that does. But I don't think JJ's off base in his seeing a third class that's created by their bylaws, just like their bylaws created a motion that doesn't exist in Roberts, a motion of no confidence, which removes a board member. They have every right to do that in their bylaws. I don't agree. I don't think we need to go there. But I think that's the next plausible interpretation. One of those two are the ones that harmonize the bylaws. However, I do see those other conventions as special conventions only slightly favor that interpretation over what JJ said. But I do favor it. But let me say, there's even a little bit of an example. It doesn't walk on all fours on the LNC. We're going to get to that. Let me read the Roberts portion first. I don't think we need to look at the bylaws here for a minute. I think I can go back to my main screen here for one moment. 913, a special meeting. Ronar 913. A special meeting or called meeting is a separate session of a society held at a time different than any regular meeting. Well, the regular meeting, as we saw, is every 2 years. So if this is not it is a time different, and only to consider one or more items of business specified in the call of the meeting. It's certainly specified in the bylaws. It's a nominating convention. It's not a regular convention because the bylaws knew the word regular. They used it. Unfortunate or not, they used it. Notice of the time, place, and purpose of the meeting. clearly and specifically describing the subject matter of the motions or items of business to be brought up. And I think they've never followed this correctly, by the way, in their special meetings. But that's a whole other thing. Must be sent to members a reasonable number of days in advance. Now, the bylaws can supersede that by giving a specified number. Otherwise, it defaults to Roberts, which is reasonable, which is not the case here. There are certain timeframes in the bylaws. The reason for special meetings is to deal with matters that might arise between regular meetings. Now, we're going to start going into the bylaws about these two types of things, and they are dealing with things that arise between regular meetings. In fact, we learned that there are certain state laws that require them to have their regular meeting at a certain point, but the National Convention stopped having its conventions in July, making them have another convention to nominate their delegates. So it's dealing with a matter that arises between their 2-year regular meetings and that require action by the society before the next regular meeting or to dedicate an entire session to one or more particular matters. The argument seems to be that because it's predictable and on a schedule, it can't be special. The LNC has monthly special meetings. Now, ours lay it out more specifically and call it a special meeting, but to say it somehow violates Roberts to have a special meeting on a regular schedule is disproven by the LNC itself. If we can do that via our policy manual or a motion that is basically enacting a special rule of order, you can be damn certain that the bylaws can do it. So the parent body has regularly scheduled special meetings. The term regular meeting or stating meeting refers to the periodic business meeting of a permanent society, local branch, or board. Now I'm going to read what I wrote here. Much weight has been placed on the idea that special meetings cannot be periodically scheduled. I already said the LNC does it. It is true that they're not typically done so, but the Assembly has the authority to override the typical definitions of runner, particularly when an item of special business is known to come up at periodic intervals that make it impossible to deal with at the regular business meeting. More weight should be placed on the whole phrase, periodic business meeting without limitation, meaning the meeting at which all forms of business except those specifically precluded are heard. But because of the scheduling of the National Convention and the laws surrounding primaries, they can't hear those items of business at their regular meeting. And to repeat what I said, the LNC itself has special meetings which are periodically scheduled monthly to deal with items that cannot or should not wait until the regular meetings. It is our standing rules which make it so, and the fact that they are periodic do not change the fact that we specifically call them special meetings. And the fact that conventions that cannot be regular conventions or Article 3 would be absurd, and by their very name are dedicated to specific items of business, are not changed from their character of being special meetings simply because they're predictable. I'm sorry. That's just insane. That is what makes people hate Roberts. Honestly. The confusion, and I put by some people, not the parliamentarians, and exploitation is coming from the fact that the word regular is amphibolous and multivalent. It can mean the customary generic thing, or it can mean the predictable thing. But it also can mean one without the other. The term regular in Ronar appears to require both, but the definition of special does not appear to require the absence of both, but certainly the absence of the first meaning, which is the customary generic thing. So that, to me, is a perfectly sound, people can disagree, using the bylaws as my primary reference and then going to Roberts for my position that these are special conventions. Though I do find JJ's other explanation persuasive, I'm not as convinced as I am of what I just said. Let's go back to the bylaws. Okay. We're going to go back to that in a moment. Actually, I want to go to this page one sec, because I said there are some exceptions in the bylaws for things that can be heard at any convention, including a special convention. Why? Oh, I'm on the wrong screen. Go to page 2, item number 10, where it talks about the motion of no confidence. It says that this could be heard at a convention, so it would be any kind of convention. And then there's a few other exceptions. One of them is replacing a district representative. But here's another bylaw that is rendered absurd. Under Judicial Committee, all of these committee members shall be elected to a 2-year term at a regular convention, same language, and shall serve until the final adjournment of the next regular convention. It's a 2-year term. It's not a 4-month term. And we know that then totally rules out both of those other kinds of conventions from being a regular convention, because they are approximately 2 years apart, as defined by the terms of office. So, under the section here, conventions, and it talks about why they have them. They all have to do with elections, which puts them at the mercy of the state. So, it says, when they shall have these in order to deal with issues having to do with elections. And specifically calls it a candidate nominating convention. But something that hasn't really been brought up, JJ I think brought this up. If you go to the top of the second page there, right after it talked about the candidate nominating convention, it says, during odd number years, the party shall hold a regular state convention, putting the two things in opposite to each other. Yes, you might think it's an unfortunate wording, but we have to go with the wording as it is, not as we wish it to be. It could have easily, they know the word regular, they just used it in the same clause, but defined the odd number years as holding a regular state convention, gives you the dates it must be held between, which do not allow them to nominate their candidates. But here's which it gives this the authority, performing such business as required herein. That is the definition of a regular convention that never appears in any of the others. And where the bylaws authorize something specifically, other things of the same class are hereby prohibited. Now, just because there's another mechanism by which a special convention can be held doesn't mean the other ones are not special conventions, just because they're specifically laid out. They are specifically authorized, and another way to get a special convention is the fact that a special convention is mentioned by another route doesn't mean that any of the others are not special conventions. You have to look at the character of them. Otherwise, if you're going to be consistent with that, then the fact that a regular convention is spelled out means that none of the others can be regular. And that is not why I argued it. I argued it in conjunction with the 2-year. I do understand how those other conventions came to be added, and they worded it badly. Intent does not come into play when it is clear, and Article 3 is clear. Custom falls to the ground when it is in violation of the bylaws, and the bylaws clearly state that the Judicial Committee has the right to make these determinations, and I really somewhat find it baffling how people who aren't in Michigan are arguing so vehemently against the society under its own bylaws, exercising its right to interpret its bylaws. And their failure is their fault. Now, I want to show you something else that's really bad here that is going to come up. When you're dealing with special conventions, because there is a petition right now to hold a special convention, there is an irreconcilable conflict in their bylaws, and a decision will have to be made by the executive committee. All right? And I know the decision that I think is the proper one. It says the party shall hold a special convention within 45 days upon the call of the executive committee or when petitions are submitted by 10% of the current members specifying the purpose for the special convention. So it sounds like when they get the petition within 45 days, this convention has to happen. However, if you go to the next paragraph 4, subsection 2, the executive committee shall issue a call to each state convention. So all of those types of conventions, no later than 60 days. How can you give 60 days notice if you have to have the convention within 45 days? This is a horrible conflict in their bylaws. But because it's dealing with notice requirements and absentee rights, you have to default to the higher number that protects the most rights. And part of that is because the way their delegates are assigned by counties, unlike Colorado, where is everyone. Thank you, DELEGATES, for the super chat. I super appreciate it. Because their counties send delegates, that doesn't happen in all states. It happens in some. They have their own bylaws to contend with. They have to have their own nominating conventions for delegates, at least some of them presumably do in their bylaws, and may have a 30-day requirement themselves, and they have to have time to organize and schedule. So to me, the 60 days makes perfect sense as to why it's so long, particularly since they have to send their list of delegates to the credentials committee no later than 7 days prior to the convention. So you've just put the 45 days down to 38 days. And if they have a 30-day notice requirement, you just gave them the period of a week in which to have a convention, which is untenable. So I know people circulating a special convention think that they're going, this goes back to the stupidity of trying to petition for a special convention. It can't be held for at least 60 days. And the board has to set a date, which they don't allow email motions. So it's going to be at their next, whenever their next board meeting is, which I don't know, could be a couple weeks out. So you're now dealing with 75 days. You are coming like butting right against when the every other year regular convention will take place. This is just an insane personality conflict dick measuring contest. Okay. And we already dealt with the delegate nominating convention. Okay, one thing I wanted to get back to. That was the vote of no confidence, which is on page 2. Okay, it's that highlighted paragraph on the left there. Now, I know JJ doesn't agree with me here. That's okay. I'm glad to see some disagreement. A member of the executive committee, and again, I think part of the reason of disagreement is I'm interpreting this thoroughly seeped in a libertarian culture, and that is my axis that I say right off the bat. So a member of the executive committee who misses 3 consecutive meetings or fails to perform his or her fiduciary duties. Now, that's not defined in Roberts anywhere. However, it is defined in law in many places. And the allegations against Andrew, of course, they fluffed them up by the time it came to the alleged removal at the July 9th convention. But it is pretty obvious leading up to it is that they just didn't like him and they thought he was divisive. That is not a breach of fiduciary duty. Parliamentary authority, which is persuasive, not binding, but which does detail out what valid cause is again the American Institute. Let's go back now to my camera and I'll put chat back up because I think we're done looking at the specific bylaws. Where's my widget for the chat? Why isn't that coming up? What is going on here? Here we go. Okay. So in the standard code, examples of conduct that are not valid grounds for removal from office are poor performance as an officer due to lack of ability, negligence that is not gross or willful, he didn't intend it, it could just be sloppy, a tendency to create friction and disagreement, which is basically the problem that the National Party had with me. Because, yeah, I do create friction and disagreement with corrupt assholes. And mere unsuitability to hold office. Now, this isn't binding, but it's certainly persuasive. And considering that they are under the Michigan corporate law, I would think corporate law probably has a large body of case law that has to do with what breach of fiduciary duty is. I'm not a lawyer, so I didn't look that up. But when you're alleging something like that, you should give a person a trial. Whether or not your bylaws require it, your libertarian principles should require it. Shame on you. Now, the fact is, they didn't like that he auto-ascended to chair, because their bylaws does not provide for a different specific procedure other than the default Roberts, which is that, the first vice chair ascends and in a vacancy in vice chair, then it's the next highest ranking vice chair, which was Andrew. So what Mr. Caney tried to do is smuggle in a bylaws amendment, or at least a temporary one, like a suspension of the bylaws through a bogus vote of no confidence. He pretty much came out and said it. And you can't amend the bylaws on even numbered years, and depending upon how you interpret that amendment section, he didn't have the vote totals for it anyway. So, go back to my notes. Is this the bylaws? This is the bylaws. Where's my notes? My notes are here. Okay, talking about notice and offices. Crap, I haven't been drinking my got a bit lathered up here. I'm not going to say out of all the cases, but to me, and again, people can disagree, this is one of the most clear-cut cases I personally believe I've seen. And I like that it came at it after it already happened, so I don't have any kind of baggage attached to it. Even though, obviously, in all cases, even when I have baggage attached to it, I make every attempt to be impartial. But I make no bones of saying that I certainly, leading into the JC appeals of Massachusetts and Delaware, had developed deep friendships. So there was an emotional attachment, though I certainly did try to be impartial, as I always do. And while Andrew and I are friends, before that, I don't think we've ever talked as much as we have recently. It isn't like we were BFF. We were fellow party members. I knew people on the other side way better than I knew Andrew. Reminds me of New Hampshire in a way, where Gilletta Jarvis was a friend of mine. Yeah, let's deal with that Joe Brungart statement. Bylaws are just an arbitrary set of rules. There is one sense in which that's correct. If you mean arbitrary, meaning there's no set predestined outcome when you sit down to write bylaws. In that sense, they're arbitrary. But after they're written, they're not arbitrary. They are the contract between the party and its membership. It describes the rights and duties of all people involved. That is absolutely crazy for that to be in a JC hearing. And also the complete going after Connor was completely inappropriate. If allegedly, and of course, Roberts does not have a duty of recusal, kept claiming he was biased and he should be recused, then Joe Brungart, Greg Stempel, all kinds of people should not have submitted things to the Judicial Committee because they were obviously biased themselves. There's no such thing in these sorts of things when you're a party to these proceedings, or somebody who knows the people in a small insular party, that you're not going to have feelings and a bias. As long as those are not secret, you're not taking money behind the scenes and things like that. But to me, it's really rich to have board members who obviously, like people who got positions because of this. Joe became chair because of this. Yeah, he's got a lot to lose. And that's okay. He can have that feeling. But if you're going to disqualify Connor, you best apply that to yourself, because the sauce is good for the goose and the gander. And on that ground, I will admit a personal bias that I feel extraordinarily, I have the utmost respect for Connor. And I feel, I get a little mama hen with younger people that I consider the up-and-coming leaders in the party when they get unjustly attacked. And I think Connor is one of those up-and-coming leaders, and I have nothing but the utmost respect for him. And I think he did a great job evaluating the arguments. And for people to say, oh, well, he just agreed with JJ. Well, no, they really didn't, because the JC, without knowing this is my opinion, because I didn't write an opinion in this case, found that they were special meetings, which isn't what JJ said. JJ thought they were something else, but was in agreement that they're not regular meetings, which is the point. Again, I don't really care what they're called. I think that's a little bit of navel gazing. I think what's important is that they're not a regular meeting, because regular meetings are clearly specified in the bylaws to be those meetings at which officers are elected for a 2-year term. And as I said, it takes an awful lot of parliamentary education to not see that there. And I'm saying that somewhat facetiously because I'm laughing at my own tribe. But it's like when Dolly Parton said, it costs a fortune to look this trashy. Like, you got to do, it takes an awful lot of learning to make something that's so obvious not mean what it says it means. It's a 2-year term. The regular conventions are 2 years apart. Anything particularly that's not close to that 2-year mark is not a regular convention. Because and they proved that that's not their interpretation. So to say that the intent of the makers was for these to be regular conventions is shown up by their own bylaws that say the officers only serve until the next regular convention. Next, okay, where we did the standards of, unless the bylaws clearly provide otherwise, which these bylaws do not. They say that vacancies can be filled at any state convention. It doesn't say regardless, it doesn't say without notice, which is what it would need to say. It says, unless the bylaws clearly provide otherwise, notice of filling a vacancy in office must always be given to the members of the body that will elect the person to fill it. If the bylaws are silent as to the method of filling a vacancy in the specific case of the presidency, and in cases our chairs are the equivalent of presidents, I now understand why Roberts uses that term. I'm so steeped in libertarian stuff that because it's such a foreign term, I hated it reflexively. But that's because chair can be both a title and a role. The president doesn't necessarily chair meetings. That can be somebody else. But in the LP, president and chair are synonymous. In the specific case of the presidency, the vice president or first vice president automatically becomes president for the remainder of the term, and the vacancy to be filled arises in the vice presidency or lowest ranking vice presidency. If another method of filling a vacancy in the presidency is desired, it must be prescribed and specified as applying to the office of president in particular. And one thing I'll note with the JC decision, it was unanimous. So Connor's vote ended up not mattering, but I don't agree that he had some kind of recusable bias. Okay, let's see here. Oh, and it should go without saying, guess what's not a breach of fiduciary duty? Being chair and making a ruling that people don't like, because that's really what this all comes down to. Certain members of the executive committee did not like that Andrew ruled that he automatically ascended to the chairmanship and issues of filling vacancies. But it was primarily his ascending to the chairmanship. They didn't like that ruling, so they sought to remove him. I am sorry, but that's bad faith. Now, let's go to, does the Judicial Committee even have the authority to hear this? Article 5, Judicial Committee, subsection 2. The Judicial Committee shall decide cases involving alleged violations of these bylaws or resolutions. Doesn't limit it at all. It doesn't say alleged violations of the bylaws by the Executive Committee. It's at any time. The Judicial Committee, in this case, is the final arbiter. Yeah, I will actually say mad respect to Josh Martin in that, where he had said he disagrees. However, the society has a process for resolving these disputes. The dispute has been resolved. Move on. And I agree with that. You win some, you lose some. That's what happens. So now some people will compare it to the National Judicial Committee, in which the National Judicial Committee, with very limited exceptions, cannot override a ruling at convention, which is what some people were arguing couldn't be done here. But I'm sorry, that's not what their bylaws say. Their bylaws gives their Judicial Committee sweeping appellate authority. The national bylaws, by contrast, do not. The national bylaws say the subject matter of the Judicial Committee is limited to consideration of only those matters expressly identified below. Suspension of affiliate parties. Oh, don't let me forget that. Let me circle this because I want to show you, I want to tell you another bad bylaw that they have. Suspension of officers, suspension of National Committee's members at large, voiding of National Committee decisions, and when you go back to the article where it talks about it, it says if the National Committee violated the bylaws. It can't just be that you didn't like the ruling, it has to violate the bylaws. Challenges to platform planks, so that's one decision at convention that can be overridden. Challenges to resolutions, that's another thing. So a resolution is like a non-platform position. And suspension of presidential and vice presidential candidates. I'm not reading what's in LPNC bylaws. This is national. So LPNC might have cribbed them from national. And I think Colorado say the same thing. It's very similar. But Michigan doesn't. Michigan gives them way more authority. Okay. Another bad bylaw. Article 4, local party organizations, subsection 6. It basically talks about disaffiliation. They call it revocation. Same thing, disaffiliation. And it says they get to appeal to their JC. Fine. But check out this last sentence. The affiliate party may appeal the ruling of the Judiciary Committee to the Judicial Committee of the National Libertarian Party following the above procedure. No, they can't. No, they can't. You can't, in a lower body's in an affiliate's bylaws put a duty on the National Judicial Committee that doesn't exist in the national bylaws. I read you the jurisdiction of the National Party Judicial Committee, and it isn't hearing disputes of revocation of county affiliate status from Michigan. Now, if the parties all agreed, they could contact the members of the Judicial Committee of the National Committee and ask them to be private arbiters, but they're not then functioning as the National Judicial Committee, which has a very limited jurisdiction that does not include county disputes from Michigan. That is just a completely like, what? What were you smoking when that bylaw was written? The national parties never had that kind of jurisdiction. Now, do I think it would be a bad idea with some of these cases we've seen that if a state party's bylaws so allow, the National Judicial Committee can adjudicate certain disputes, but it would have to be with the consent of the state party and their bylaws? Yeah, I think that might be a good idea. But it's not in there. So I am satisfied with my position. I am satisfied that I explained it properly. If people want to think I'm out of my tree, even with that explanation, which I think is eminently reasonable on multiple fronts, they're free to do so. I'll still sleep like a baby. That's my position. And I believe I argued from logic. I argued from parliamentary authority. And I also argued using very sound debate methodology. What a lot of people don't know, well, more people know this than the second thing, is I'm not a lawyer, but I do have a background in law. When did I became a paralegal in it was a long time ago. It's over 25 years. So I've got, and anyone who knows the work paralegals do, a lot of times we're doing what the attorneys do, but it has to be signed off by the attorney making it their work product, kind of like a subcontractor has the contractor sign off. Now, that's not true in all cases, but a lot of paralegals know just as much about the law in their field of specialty. And my field of specialty is in insurance policies, which is pretty damn close to bylaws, is an interpretation of policy language. But the background also I have that a lot of people don't know is before I was involved in the LP, so probably about 15 years of experience with this, I used to be the owner of a debate forum. So while not professionally trained in debate, I got the boots on the ground, rubber meets the road experience. So I am satisfied with my interpretation. I personally think that I made a reasonable case. And at this point, I leave it to the party members and anyone else to decide. But on this last point, this is sheer opinion that this is just as now stepping back as just a Libertarian Party person. Well, it's a little bit parliamentary, mostly personal opinion type thing. Your bylaws provide the method for which these disputes are resolved. Continuing to litigate it afterwards, when you've reached the final court, you can say you personally disagree. But if you're going to be a productive member, and I think I did mark this in parliamentary law where it talked about that being in a parliamentary society means you fight like a tiger for your position, but once it's been decided through the parliamentary process set up by your bylaws, you cheerfully uphold the decision until there's a legitimate and productive means to change your bylaws or do whatever you need to do. Now, I always haven't been the best at that, for certain. But I also didn't bust into an LNC meeting and say, well, I recognize the Judicial Committee's authority. They just had it wrong. And I continued to promote the party and its interests until my next opportunity, which was at convention. Your next opportunity, dear Libertarian Party of Michigan members, is at your regular convention between April 1st and July 31st, whatever those dates were, at which time you can amend your bylaws and you can elect a whole new slate of officers. If you don't like Andrew, you can vote him out. And you can do it legitimately. The baby temper tantrums that are going on right now, now this is my personal opinion, just as a LP member, say more about you than this other stuff. Violating an NDA as well. Using a psychically damaging motion to get your way against another human being is low. And you ought to be ashamed of yourself. That was a bad move, and you ought to feel bad for doing it. All right. How long were we? 2 hours. It wasn't 3 hours, but I think I got it all. Any Michigan people, I'm giving priority to you. Is there something I missed that you wanted me to cover? Because I was asked to do the show. I really wasn't intending upon it to let Michigan people, primarily Michigan people, know where I stood. I have worked very, very hard to, even amongst my detractors, not all of them, but amongst a lot of them, to earn a position of trust and fairness and good faith. And I was asked to give my opinion on that. And I've worked very, very hard for this position of trust, and nothing would ever cause me to betray it. Not friendship, not anything. But since this was, though I do love to educate all members of the party, particularly go look at your bylaws and learn your lesson. My God, learn your lesson. So I see Andrew said that I pretty much covered everything, but I'm giving time because I know there's some other Michigan members here. And if additional questions come up, I will maybe do some supplemental shows. I'm sure they're going to continue, no matter how foolhardy I think it is. Pursue a special convention. If they give proper notice and whatever, you know, I'm not a Michigan member. I care about the procedure. While the outcome I might have some personal feelings about, I'll leave it at that. But I do think the issue that's going to come to a head, and I agree with JJ, but the petition says it can be virtual. I think they kind of leave it up to the board. So the board can make the decision pursuant to its bylaws that it has to be in person. But I think the issue that's going to come to a head is the 45 versus 60-day thing. Because those are some terrible bylaws. So I think the May thing leaves it up to the board. I think it'd be very problematic if the board scheduled it online. But it's very, very interesting considering the history that your bylaws draw a distinction between meeting and convention, because Roberts doesn't necessarily do that. But what's going to come to a head is going to be the 45 versus 60 days. And it's my opinion, I think it's JJ's as well. I don't know if he's given an official opinion on it. You got to give the 60 days notice. And you've got to set the date and do all of those things at a meeting of the board, whenever that is. But other than those issues, unless some other parliamentary issues come up, I am going to be butting out of Michigan's business. I said my opinion on this particular controversy of the Judicial Committee decision. I think the Judicial Committee had it spot on. They made a lot of the same arguments I did, but I think I made some different arguments. I think I gave some expanded arguments that they didn't give, that they could have. And, yeah, so otherwise, I've got other things. I've got my own. I'm the Colorado Bylaws Committee Chair, and I am the National Bylaws Committee Chair, and I've really got to concentrate on those things. And I'm sure, unfortunately, though I pray not, there'll probably be some other controversies that come up at state conventions. Hopefully not. I hope springs eternal. I'm not going to be at very many conventions this year. I am going to be at the New Hampshire State Convention, and I've got to prepare for that. So I need to start writing out some scripts. I need to look at their bylaws amendments to make sure they're not doing something horrible. And try to catch it. I wish they had involved me in their bylaws committee meetings, but the report's out. I can only look at the finished product and alert them to any potential issues. So I've really got to concentrate on that. Tomorrow will be exactly 30 days till the New Hampshire convention. So I need to pay attention to that. But God, I hope Southwest has its shit straightened out by then, because I'm flying Southwest. Then March 10th is the next LNC meeting. And I'm not sure what else. I was going to be advising some members in Arizona at their convention, but it turned out it's going to be the same date as the New Hampshire convention. It was going to be the week before. When the date got changed, I was like, ugh, sorry, I've got a conflict. So, and then the Colorado convention is April 1st. And I think those are all the conventions I'm going to be going to. At least those are all I've planned on. Though, what was I going to say? Oh, sorry, I'm just getting a little tired. I've been extraordinarily tired. Thyroidism. But if you have a state convention and you are looking for a parliamentarian, get in touch. For as long as I possibly can, which right now is indefinite, I do not charge libertarians. I can't say that's going to be forever, but get me out there, feed me, and put me in a hotel, and you've got a parliamentarian for your convention with no professional fees, just costs. I love doing it. And to be honest, it is also a resume builder. But I do love doing it. And at this point in my life, I'm very cash poor, so I try to volunteer. That's the value I can bring to the party right now. I can't donate so much, but I can give skills. All right, everyone, that is going to be it for this evening. I am super tired. And I need to finish this mimosa. I thought I was going to be drinking like a fish this meeting. Particularly with, I love this freaking this Libertarian Party of Louisiana cup. So I hope you have an awesome night. And thank you. Thank you all for your attention. Bye-bye.
living, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe.